Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this most auspicious day. My name is Sabina Sheck, and I have the great fortune of being the faculty director for Chicago Studies. I would first like to thank Chris Scable, who's the director of Chicago Studies, and his incredible staff and student team for organizing an exciting year of Chicago-focused programming. On behalf of Chris and the Chicago Studies Faculty Advisory Board, it is my pleasure to welcome you on a day quite apt for discussing the resurrected city. Today's presentation is the first in a series of distinguished lectures, community conversations, and other events that seek to reimagine the future of Chicago after this extremely challenging period in our city's and nation's history. This Chicago Future series is a collaboration between two offices in the college at the University of Chicago. Chicago Studies offers curricular and co-curricular opportunities for the college community to study, engage with, and positively contribute to the diverse communities of our world-class city. The Parazia program for public discourse, whose director Leela Brammer will offer our next lecture in 2 weeks' time, offers courses and programming that aim to develop communicative competence and foster vigorous, inclusive, and productive public discourse within a wide variety of communities. More information about today's sponsors and future events can be found at the Chicago Studies website, chicagostudies.uchicago.edu/futures. I encourage you during the talk to enter your comments and questions using the Q&A function. I will relay these to our speaker, as many of these as I can, to our speaker in the Q&A session immediately after his remarks. To introduce today's program and speaker, it is my great pleasure to turn things over to the Martin A. Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of History and the Dean of the College, John Boyer.
Thank you, Sabina, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our new series on the Chicago Futures. This series began in a very informal way, as I think all good things, or many good things do, a conversation between Chris Grable and myself last fall. We were looking at all of these stories that have appeared in the news, in daily newspapers and on other forms of media about the crisis of American cities in general, cities as ghost towns, cities from which people are fleeing, and the kind of doom and gloom sense of what will happen to all of our cities, not just Chicago. And we thought it might be interesting to problematize those assumptions and what exactly is going to happen to the great American city in the aftermath of the greatest crisis since certainly the Great Depression, and the greatest crisis in all of our lives. And so the pandemic has hit Chicago hard, as it has hit all of our great cities. But crises are also opportunities to think about the future in strategic and tactical ways, and how we can work together to shape that future in ways that we might like that future to be, as opposed to not be. I think this is particularly important for universities. Chicago is blessed by having a number of great universities in its midst: University of Chicago, Northwestern University, Loyola University, DePaul University, University of Chicago, University of Illinois, Chicago. These are all great places, and they all profit enormously, and they contribute enormously to the welfare of the city. Their welfare and the city's welfare are conjoined, and it's our collective interest, it seems to me, to think about our city, how it will fare in the months and years ahead, how we can respond to the many social, economic, cultural, organizational, and normative problems and challenges that we're facing, and how we can make our city a stronger, more vibrant, more equitable, more just, and more successful place of urban sociability and urban progress in the aftermath of this great disaster. We thought, as a way of beginning our series, and as a way of looking to the future, we would look to the past. And we begin our series with a very important episode in our past that also involved a crisis of enormous proportions for those who experienced it, namely the Great Fire of 1871. And to take us on this journey, we're very honored and pleased to have Professor Carl Smith, our colleague from Northwestern University, to join us. Carl is the Franklin Bliss Snyder Professor of English and American Studies and a Professor of History Emeritus at Northwestern. He's the author of a number of quite wonderful books, all of whom I'm proud to say were published by the University of Chicago Press: Urban Disorder and the Shape of Belief, a book on Daniel Burnham and the Burnham Plan, a book on Chicago and the American literary imagination, and most recently a book called City Water, City Life, Water and the Infrastructure of Ideas in Urbanizing Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago. These are all wonderful books, and they're all available at various places your perusal and perhaps even for your purchase. So we're delighted to welcome Carl and delighted that he's able to join us to kick off our series with a lecture called The Resurrected City. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to ask Carl Smith to give his presentation.
Thank you, John. Thank you all. Thanks to Chris Grable and Sabrina Scheck and Chicago Studies and the college. And I'm obviously very interested in Chicago Studies, and I'd like to be a continuing resource. So if anyone wishes to raise any question with me, feel free to email me at cjsmith@northwestern.edu, or you can find me by looking me up. Chris told me he was prompted to invite me because of my recent book on the Great Chicago Fire, Chicago's Great Fire, the Destruction and Resurrection of an Iconic American City. And I'll talk a little bit about it. It's a narrative history of the Great Chicago Fire and the rebuilding in the years that follow. While it's detailed and carefully documented, I hope it's still a lively and engaging chronological account of the fire. The fire started, as some of you know, in the barn of Catherine and Patrick O'Leary at Des Plaines and Jefferson Streets in the near west sides, where the Chicago Fire Academy is now sited, on about 9 p.m. Sunday evening, October 8th, 1871. For reasons discussed in the book, the fire department, while it was sort of state of the art for the time, if wildly undermanned, was delayed in its arrival at the fire. By the time it arrived, it was helpless to stop it, especially once the waterworks collapsed. And the fire, nothing stopped it. It burned itself out about 30 hours later, early in the morning of Tuesday, October 10th. In that time, it burned a chunk of the west side, leaped the south branch of the Chicago River, leveled the entire commercial heart of the city, which was where it is now, jumped also the main branch and destroyed virtually the entire built-up section of the north side. Keep in mind that at that point, Chicago was much smaller than it is now, about 36 square miles, about a sixth of what it is now. The northern border was Fullerton Avenue, 2400 North, the western one, what is now Pulaski, the southern one, now around 33rd Street, Pershing Road. And that's incidentally where the original University of Chicago was established in 1856 on land given by Stephen Douglas next to a military camp called Camp Douglas that became a notorious Confederate prisoner of war prison. The separate town of Hyde Park, where the modern university was established in 1890, was a few miles to the south. It's not part of Chicago until 1889. The Great Fire was indeed great. It was one of the largest fires in urban fires in history, comparable with the London Fire of 1666, the Moscow one of 1812, the fire that followed the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. It burned an area about 4 miles long and about 2/3 of a mile wide. It burned about 1/3 of the city's property value. It burned about 1/3 of the city's building, 18,000 out of 60,000 buildings. The north side lost 13,300 of 13,800 buildings. 3 of the 4 downtown railroad depots, 1,600 stores, 28 hotels, 60 factories, about 1/4 of the city's churches, and everything in all these places except what people could grab and run with. It was a horrific experience. It's of its time. People think of things in terms of recent events. A lot of people say it was like the Civil War all over again, fire everywhere, wider than the eye can see. Some people likened it to Judgment Day, to hell itself. It wasn't just one fire, but multiple ones because of a strong wind from the southwest and updrafts. Pieces of burning Chicago were thrown into the air and then would land farther ahead on dry parts of the city and start another fire. But at certain points, the main part of the fire was as much as a half a mile thick, a few thousand degrees hot. It was hot enough to melt glass, to bend iron, to pulverize limestone and cement buildings. Wooden buildings, which most of Chicago was, as I'll get to, just went like pieces of paper in a fireplace. 90,000 people of the city's 330,000 people were left instantly homeless, more without jobs. Miraculously, only about 300 people died, probably because they could see the fire coming. But as remarkable as was the destruction, the rapidity as well as the scale of the rebuilding was in some ways more remarkable. The city barely paused at all in its already breathtaking growth. And you have to understand what Chicago was like before the fire. In 1830, it barely existed. It was an obscure frontier outpost with about 100 people. There were about 30,000 by 1850 and 300,000 by the census of 1870. 10 times growth in 20 years and about 330,000, as I've said, the time of the fire. Chicago was at that point neck and neck with St. Louis, of being now the fourth biggest city in the country. It would soon pass St. Louis after New York, Philadelphia, and Brooklyn, which at that point was a separate city. And it kept on going. By 1880, there were 500,000 people in Chicago, and by 1890, the city's population topped 1 million, and Chicago was, at that point, the second biggest city in the United States after New York. And the number of people counted in those periods are nothing compared to the churn of people passing through this major nexus. Within 2 years after the fire, by the fall of 1873, a new downtown had emerged that was about twice the size of the pre-fire one, and buildings were a little bit taller. The skyscraper revolution is not for another 15 years or so, in the late 1880s. But Chicago was no longer a walking city where people basically lived near where they worked, but a streetcar and commuter metropolis expanding outward, with people, with downtown being more and more commercial and people residential being farther and farther out. The city celebrated its stunning recovery in the fall of 1873 with a big cultural and trade fair called the Interstate Exposition, in an enormous building built in a three cupola structure. It was a three cupola structure on the lakefront where the Art Institute of Chicago now is, on the eastern side of Michigan Avenue. Grant Park, as we know it, did not exist at that point. The city's triumphant recovery was celebrated even more grandly a few years later, I should say 20 years later, with the World's Columbian Exposition held very near the University of Chicago in a reconfigured Jackson Park, with additional displays and amusements along the midway. And again, speaking of resurrections, right next to the new University of Chicago, founded in 1890. And you can see photographs that include the great Ferris wheel on the midway and the original portion of the quad. As I said, the book tells this story. It emphasizes the human dimension of disaster as a lived experience, relying a great deal on the several hundred first-person recollections, as well as a host of other sources from the time, including about 70 contemporary illustrations and 7 maps. I'll show you a few illustrations from the book now. Excuse me. Here's the cover of the book. Here's what Chicago looked like on the eve of the fire. You see the main branch of the river and the north and south branch, dividing it into the 3 parts, with the railroad running on this is where Grant Park would eventually be, and fill some of it from the fire. Here's the Chicago as a place where all kinds of people from all parts of the country, you see frontiersmen and Native Americans and people in fancy clothes coming and going through the city. This is from 1871. This is a typical kind of house, and of all the tens of thousands of buildings, this happens to be the house of Patrick and Catherine O'Leary, the one in the rear. They actually own 2 houses. That 2-room pine shanty in the back was where they lived. But what you see, as this is all the fuel for the fire, not only places like this, but the picket fences that were everywhere and these wooden sidewalks that were like laying kindling for starting a fire. And then, of course, the myth that Mrs. O'Leary starting the fire, which we can talk about, but I'm not going to talk about at great length, except that it's not true. And the great tumult in the street, people grabbing what they could, getting wagons, running, taking their valuables, taking their relatives is like Aeneas leaving Troy with his father on his back, fleeing the city. There were rumors, I'll talk about this a bit, of wild carousing and of looting in the city, and of people breaking open whiskey and getting drunk. Also of incendiaries running through the city, as they supposedly did when Paris was burning at the end of the Commune, and righteous citizens lynching them up right there on the spot. People rushing in every direction to get away, mostly across the bridges, many of which collapsed, but going to the open prairie to the north along the lakefront in the north and south divisions. And at this point also into the city cemetery, which is the bottom of what is now Lincoln Park today, with the lake over here and North Avenue over here, going through the Potter's Field and leaving stuff along the way as they flee. You get a sense of the size of the fire here. North is to the right, Mrs. O'Leary's barn over here, the top of the north side over here. Each of these concentric circles is a mile. So you see the 4-mile width of length of the fire, with the downtown right about here. The devastation, just unearthly. This is from the cover of the book. This is the corner of State and Madison, later called the world's busiest corner. A few days after the fire, with the streetcars running again and bricks being reclaimed for rebuilding, but much of this rubble pushed into the lake. The fire, as I'll explain, spurred an enormous outpouring of private aid. This is the financier of some low reputation, Jim Fisk, getting together a wagon for contributions for the sufferers of Chicago, being sent to the city. They piled it on an Erie train that supposedly went 60 miles an hour, rushing to Chicago, with people along the way throwing goods into it along the way. Then giving out aid given to Chicago, people lining up to be given clothing and food and that sort of thing, a child being fitted for shoes, and rebuilding. A little higher, a little stronger, innovative use of derricks for the first time, and various other techniques to build. This interstate exposition that I mentioned to you, this enormous 3-cupola building, the Art Institute of Chicago, this was knocked down about 18 years later for the Art Institute of Chicago, which is on this exact spot. And the fair, of course, the great fair, celebrating the complete coming out of Chicago after the fire. And here, along the midway, the first Ferris wheel, 264 feet from top to bottom. And here, the early buildings of the University of Chicago, just a block away. Maybe after the pandemic, the university will put up the Ferris wheel again. The emblem of the fair, the I Will Maiden, the I Will Woman, the I Will Amazon, this woman with the I Will written on her breastplate, with the phoenix, the symbol of the reborn Chicago, coming out of a crown on her head. The University of Chicago, perhaps Professor Boyer can explain, I don't know for sure how much this relates to the fire, as part of its emblem is the phoenix, identifying with the rebuilt city. The book tries to answer some large questions. How could such an enormous fire happen? Not to mention whether there's any truth to the story of the Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. There were some special circumstances that made what was a perfect storm, we'll call the perfect fire. But the underlying reason for the Great Chicago Fire was that it was a consequence of Chicago's rapid growth, almost entirely out of wood, sloppily. And so it was just a glorified fire trap, a disaster waiting to happen. So any of us, of small fire of a very common kind, could produce such a terrible result. As newspaper editors, other observers, the fire department observed and warned repeatedly. There were 24 fires in the week before the Great Chicago Fire, any one of which could have triggered if the circumstances were right. Why was Chicago able to recover and rebuild so quickly? The short answer is it rebuilt so quickly for the same reason it built so quickly in the first place. Chicago is the fullest creation in the 19th century of the forces that defined the period and of modernity generally. Immigration, westward expansion, industrialization, the communication and transportation revolutions in which it was a major node, 5 years before the fire, the transatlantic cable was completed. 2 years before the fire, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. And of course, urbanization. Chicago owed its development above all to its critical location in the right place at the right time. At the western edge of the Great Lakes, in the age of industrialization, near the Mississippi, between the agricultural and mining west of the industrial east, and I'm sorry, the industrial strength of the east and the agricultural and mining wealth of the west, spoken about at great length, of course, by Bill Cronin in his book Nature's Metropolis. The fire did nothing to change these key factors. Chicago was still an extraordinary, as if anything, even more attractive place for investors after the fire. It's important to remember that Chicago was largely built with outside money from the East Coast and from Europe. And this money came back again. There's a famous story of a Chicago leader named William Bross, who jumped on a train right after the city burned, went to the New York Chamber of Commerce and said, "Send your money here, never a better time to invest. And while you're at it, send your sons here. There's a great prospect for getting going in business." And for such people, it was a great place for people of energy and ambition to come to invest their lives, considering all the alternatives. The third big question the book tries to answer is, what is the place of the fire in the city's history? And this gets to our main subject for today, the resurrected city. The fire is officially and to a large extent informally remembered as a great triumph, the spirit of Chicago overcoming epic disaster. It's one of the 4 stars in the city's flag. And there's lots of evidence that I've already given you to back this up. But the story of the resurrected city, especially in the decades to follow, and frankly, to the present, is far more complicated. The key argument that the book makes is that the fire both revealed and deepened social, economic, and political divisions in the city, and that indicated that the city was as flammable in these terms as it was physically. Okay, what does that mean? I've already explained how it was flammable physically. Its social construction was also very flammable, analogous in its rapidity and volatility. Chicago was an improvised place still in 1871, a major city with almost no urban history to speak of, certainly no settled past, no settled order, its identity changing constantly. I like to cite often a quotation from Mark Twain from The Next Decade, Life on the Mississippi, when he says that Chicago you pass through is never the Chicago you saw the last time you were there. Twain, I might add, himself passed through Chicago in the fall, a few weeks after the fire, an age before obviously television, radio, anything like that. The only way to see famous people live was to see them live, and there were all these lecturers who had passed through, and he came through. He was only 35. He read part of Roughing It then. Ralph Waldo Emerson came that fall. Victoria Woodhull, who their scandalous ideas of free love and marriage came through. Frederick Douglass came through, and another famous visitor right at the turn of the year that I talk about his visit was Grand Duke Alexis of Russia, the son of Alexander II, who'd be assassinated the next decade, and whose nephew would be Tsar Nicholas II, obviously killed in the Russian Revolution. Chicago not only had little regard for the past, but it had also little focus on the present, since things are going to be different tomorrow. So what do we care if it's a fire trap? It's going to be bigger and better tomorrow. It's very fitting. This is the place where the commodities future was perfected. Everybody was from somewhere else, it appeared, and grew to adulthood somewhere else. At the time of the fire, and most often this somewhere else was far away. At the time of the fire, over 46% of Chicagoans were born in another country. About 1 in every 5 Chicagoans was born in what became Germany the year of the fire, and more than 1 in 8 in Ireland, with smaller representations from Scandinavia and from Bohemia, what we call the Czech Republic now. These immigrants and their children constituted probably well over 70% of the population. Of the so-called American population, this is a word they used then. These people are not Americans. These are Germans, even if they're born in this country, if they have German parents. Uh, uh, Many of them were from the states of the old Northwest Territory, but a significant number, particularly of the wealthier ones, were from the Middle Atlantic and New England states, especially a bunch from upstate New York and New England who controlled much of the city's wealth. People that we know people from this period whose names we still know. George Pullman and Potter Palmer were from upstate New York, Marshall Field from central Massachusetts, William Ogden, the first mayor and the entrepreneur in everything that mattered in the city, was from upstate New York as well. There was a vital African American community, but it constituted only about 1.2% of the total population. African Americans could vote in Chicago only since 1870, and the public schools wouldn't be integrated for another couple of years. Women would not get the vote for another half century. One of the Chicagoans whose fire experience the book talks about is Myra Colby Blackwell, whom the state of Illinois said could not practice law because of her sex. In spite of her obvious qualifications, she ran a publication called the Chicago Legal News, a leading legal publication in the city, and the Supreme Court backed up by a vote of 8-1 in 1873 the state of Illinois, in the famous case of Bradwell versus Illinois that Ruth Bader Ginsburg spoke about particularly a good deal in her early career. It wasn't reversed till she wasn't allowed to practice till shortly before her death in the early 1890s. It's important to avoid talking about any of these groups in the city as monoliths, such as the Germans or the Irish. There were so many of them, and there were differences between them that might be very sharp. But immigrants and their children made up the vast majority of skilled and unskilled workers, and that's labor is not a monolith either. Skilled and unskilled workers were different interest groups. But as a general rule, ethnicity, class, and religion correlated. In particular, it's very hard to overstate the overt anti-immigrant and especially anti-Catholic prejudice in the multiple mainstream daily papers, as well as anti-labor union sentiment. Anti-labor union sentiment. In any event, the city was riven on ethnic and class lines on any of a number of issues. The American population, quote unquote, supported the French in the Franco-Prussian War. The Germans obviously supported the Prussians. While the native-born Yankee elite basically ran the city politics up to mid-century, including its weak mayoralty and the strong unicameral legislative body called the Common Council, became the City Council as we know it in 1875. By 1871, immigrants constituted a majority of the city's eligible voters, about 56%, and they controlled a similar percentage of the representatives, the aldermen on the Common Council, and particularly the Irish out of proportion to their numbers. The wealthy native-born elite were very unhappy with this situation. They were used to controlling things, running the city their way, and they attacked the integrity of ethnic politicians. They saw themselves, as a phrase from the time, as the best men. They believed in a meritocracy of education and achievement, but not of democracy, not of equality. And they saw these ethnic politicians as crooks, serving these people who really did not deserve to have the same kind of influence as one of the best men in the voting booth. This kind of commentary fed on stories through the summer and fall in 1871 on the exposure and the indictment of Boss Tweed in New York. And Tweed, by the way, was himself of Scottish ancestry, American-born and a Protestant. So even before the fire, elections are very highly contested. Mayoral and aldermanic elections then held every 2 years in the fall were, as Hobbes would have it, nasty, brutish, and short. More nasty and brutish than short. And political and cultural issues often mixed. Temperance leaders, for example, almost exclusively Yankee Protestants, wanted to use the temperance issue to demean and degrade and control Irish and German Chicagoans. They demanded the enforcement of existing Sunday saloon closing laws that were not enforced. partly because in 1855 there had been a great riot trying to enforce them when a know-nothing anti-immigrant mayor named Levi Boone, a nephew of Daniel Boone, tried to close the saloons. But for these immigrant families, Sunday's the only day of rest, and a glass of beer or something with their families in a beer garden or someplace was a very important of social life. And much more, it was they were presented the idea that theirs was an inferior culture. And through the summer of 1871, there are demonstrations against attempts to push the further enforcement of the Sunday closing laws. And then on Sunday evening, October 8th, 1871, this fire devastates Chicago. The aftermath of disasters like this have a timeless as well as timely quality. They share common stages and reactions that we can see across different disasters in different times. But the particular nature of these stages depend on the circumstances of where and when they happen. In Chicago, it triggered a panic among this Yankee elite, who, to give them credit, had done a great deal to build up the city in which they prospered. But they thought the inherently destabilizing nature of an event like this would allow this underclass to rise up and cause terrible damage and seize control in the instability. And this fear was rooted in the city's already divided nation. And so there were tales, as I showed you in some of those illustrations, of this looting and drinking and arson and even rape, and of these incendiaries being strung up by respectable Chicagoans who believed in law and order. And it's in this context that we get the story of Mrs. O'Leary and her cow, which is basically an anti-Irish, anti-woman, anti-immigrant story, anti-Catholic story. And the book talks about it at length. I can't really get into it here. There's also echoes in people's eyes of the Paris Commune, of the Petroleuses running loose in the last days of the Commune, setting fire to Paris, and that's happening here. And all this is in spite of the fact that poorer Chicagoans, as part of a timeless pattern of disasters, suffered disproportionately from the fire and had fewer resources for recovery of every kind. Less insurance or no insurance, or if they had insurance, it wasn't likely to be good, no credit, no network of influential people, and this, of course, included the O'Learys. In this context, this Yankee elite staged a kind of two-part coup the week of the fire by convincing the current mayor, Roswell Mason, to take two steps. While the mayor is a weak figure at this time, he was able to do this because of all the confusion and chaos. By Wednesday, the fire ends on Monday night. They get him to appoint Civil War hero General Philip Sheridan as protector of peace and safety in the city. He was already living in the city as commander of the Army of the Missouri, whose central mission was to subdue Native Americans in the vast area between the Mississippi and the Rockies. He had no civilian power, but in this ad hoc way, he became the acting head of a very odd force, including a few infantrymen, some city police, and local militia volunteers, including a regiment called the University Guards, which consisted of students from the old University of Chicago. This de facto martial law was completely illegal. Sheridan was not enthusiastic, but he felt forced to do it, and involved a long story that I can't get into here, but I do in the book. It ended in 2 weeks when one of these university guards, a sophomore from Wisconsin, who had never fired a gun before, accidentally shot and killed the city prosecuting attorney in a misunderstanding of a curfew violation. The next step in the coup was much bigger, involved the relief funds I talked to you about that were being sent to the city, the equivalent nowadays of over $200 million. At first, this was administered by an ad hoc relief committee, when I say at first, for about 3 days, of city officials and leading citizens. But by Wednesday, representatives of a small private philanthropic organization called the Relief and Aid Society, which was controlled by that same Yankee elite. On the board were Field and Pullman and others, was demanding total control of money sent to the people of Chicago to be put in their private hands. And by Friday, the mayor put them in charge. Central to their argument was that they were men of unquestionable probity, as opposed to the crooked aldermen and who would steal the money while they would administer it honestly. In other words, this private group was going to protect the people of Chicago from the officials these people elected. The third step in the takeover was one that was already sort of ripe for the taking. It wasn't really a coup in quite the same way. There was already a mayoral election scheduled for very early November. And in this election, which is a crazy election because you still had to vote where you live, but in whole sections of the city, there were no houses. So there were shanties set up in the rubble and people voted there. And since there were no records of any kind, you had to bring people to attest that you were actually a voter. In that election, a ticket headed by Joseph Medill, the head of the key owner of the Chicago Tribune, put together a thing called the fireproof ticket. And they claimed that they were the best men, that it wasn't Democrats, it wasn't Republicans or other people. It was people of quality, of probity, of integrity and competence who would just lead the city. And they won in a landslide. They even got support in this moment after the fire of unity of the leading German language paper in the city and the nation, the German language daily, the Illinois Stadtzeitung, and of the Workingman's Advocate, the leading national labor weekly published in Chicago, which is largely about native-born laborers. But any kind of unity was unraveling almost right away. The Germans in the city, who were so many of people in Chicago, were already upset with what they saw was discrimination against them by these Yankees. The schools almost miraculously reopened a week after the fire on October 16th, with students crowding into, who had been burned out, crowding into the schools that were still open. But as is always the case in budget crunches, music and art was removed from the curriculum, but also German language. The Illinois Stadtzeitung really hated that, called this a bigoted nativism. And there were repeated complaints of discrimination against workers and foreign-born by the Relief and Aid Society. They did a remarkable job, but there's also no question they practiced discrimination. They clearly used the funds to help Chicagoans, but their main thing was to control working people and get them back to build Chicago the way that this elite wanted it. So they linked aid with work, and the work was important to both rebuilding the city and to keep people from being idle. And then a thing that sort of looked ahead to the debate over how much money to give in pandemic aid. He said, if we give people money, they won't want to work. They also accused any working person of really malingering. The assumption was that they could actually work, and they were practicing what the Relief and Aid Society called imposition, faking. So they made them fill out all kinds of forms. They made them provide references from a respectable person, usually an employer or a clergyman in the city, and then also sent someone, a professional social worker. This is the beginning of professional social work in this period, even apart from the fire, to their homes to interview them to make sure, or wherever they were living, to make sure they really needed the money. This is a humiliating process. And at the same time, they went out of their way to seek out wealthy Chicagoans who might want aid on the assumption they'd be too proud to ask. And the use of these forms discriminated against people who were illiterate entirely or illiterate in English. And there were virtually no German speaking of these visitors. But perhaps the most telling event of the continuing physical and social volatility was a central plank of the Fireproof Party platform and of new mayor Joseph Medill's agenda. And this is where the social and the physical volatility come together. This was a fight over what were called fire limits. Fire limits were an early form of building and zoning code. They're essentially, what they do is they designate in certain parts of the city you can't build with flammable materials, namely wood. There existed already for a few decades fire limits that covered only the downtown and just adjoining areas of the city, the commercial heart, but these were not enforced. And after the fire, lots of new wooden stuff was going up because you're in a hurry. The winter's coming. You need a place to live, a place to work, and that's going up. Medill wanted to, as quickly as possible, to put in fire limits in the whole city, saying no wood could be used anywhere. And this was strongly opposed by the ethnic working population in the city. This is a city where a large number of people, working people, own their own homes. Of 60,000 buildings in Chicago, 2/3 were wooden houses, and about 20% of skilled workers and 17% of unskilled workers owned their own houses, including the O'Learys. It is impossible to talk about the economic and emotional reassurance owning one's own home for a working person. It means you can't be kicked out of your house, and also Chicago belongs to me as much as it does to these wealthy people. And it's also, as the wealthy people should have known, a force of stability. People who own property do not want the order to be overthrown. Working people claimed they couldn't build with fireproof materials like brick and stone, and that their land would be worthless where they had been burned out without a home on it, and that fire limits were part of a plan that of real estate interests to try to get them to sell out cheap and consolidate real estate. Also, I might add, a lot of real estate people didn't want restrictions either. They wanted the fewest restrictions possible. And there were some wealthy people who backed this as well. This all culminated in a wild melee, a common council meeting on Monday evening of January 15th, 1872, in a new utilitarian brick temporary city hall built at LaSalle and Adams, where the Rookery now is. The common council was meeting to finally resolve this issue. It has notable similarities, haunting similarities in some respects, to events at the Capitol this past January 6th, with a lot of variations within the larger similarities. There had been, right before this meeting, a few anti-fire limits rallies in the 18th ward we now know as the Near North, the only ward that Medill didn't carry. And then on the Monday evening, a procession of working people, mostly German and Irish working people, down LaSalle Street to crossing the main branch of the river to the new temporary city hall, carrying signs like "Leave a home for the laborer," "Don't vote anymore for the poor man's oppressor," and like as on January 6th, also one with a man in a noose with the caption, "The future of those who vote for the fire ordinance." And a band was playing. The trouble was, a lot of kind of troublemakers joined in, hoping there would be trouble. So the procession got to the city hall. The alderman came to the window and looked out. People started throwing rocks. One smashed the nose and face of a Chicago policeman. The alderman ran from the building, and it just turned into a riot. The coverage in the daily English language newspapers and the Illinois Stadtzeitung talk about it like it's two different events, down to the level of detail. The English language papers say the band was playing "Watch on the Rhine." The German papers say they're playing "The Star Spangled Banner." And one group is called communists, the other are called oppressors. And the workers are blaming these troublemakers in the crowd for starting the whole thing. But in any case, basically the working people won this fight. The result was only a limited ordinance that passed sometime later, and that was not enforced. So it was a kind of win. So a stability comes, but with this larger instability under it. And in fact, there was some reason to have these fire limits. There was a second major downtown fire in the summer of 1874, in what we'd now call the South Loop. A number of African-American churches were lost in that, and a number of Jewish synagogues in that as well. But bad feeling along class and ethnic lines continued, with separate views of who were the people of Chicago and who determined its future. Different views of the resurrected city. The daily papers were meanwhile telling workers not to strike, that if they were real, true Chicagoans, they would keep wages down out of patriotism and rebuild the city and serve it that way. That was the best thing to do, keep prices down. Meanwhile, they're not telling landlords who are raising rents because there's housing shortage to keep their prices down. And there's these kinds of inequities going on all along. But the workers feel their power. There are a number of strikes, some fail, some not. And in the spring of 1872, but when the warm weather comes and the building really proceeds in earnest, the unions, the labor unions, the skilled workers organized on May 15th, 1872, 4 months exactly after the big melee in the Common Council meeting, a demonstration to show their presence and their power in the city. This is a great period, again, before the internet, of course, before telephones, before anything. the way you communicate your presence is physically. You go out in the streets and there's all kinds of marches and demonstrations of different kinds. And it also shows, among other things, is the streets belong to you. You have a place in them. So they planned a grand demonstration of trades unions for that day, May 15th, 1872. They stopped work, it cost them money, and had a great parade that started in the West Side, went to the other divisions, and then ended up with a rally in the West Side. People, workers dressed in their different colors, the stone cutters dressed in blue silk sashes and white silk sashes, and white silk aprons imprinted with the image of a mallet and a chisel on it. And they marched behind a large wagon drawn by 4 white horses, and there was a banner that on one side had a man cutting stone and the other side a portrait of George Washington. And the point of this is that they, not their employers, are the true Americans, the true Chicagoans. Well, Medill was invited to speak, and Medill was one of the most inept politicians that ever held the mayoralty. He could not read a crowd. He gave long and boring speeches, and he even resigned before even his 2-year term was up. He told them that they had the right to strike, perhaps, but the owners had the right to refuse them, and that unions, in fact, undercut basic freedoms of the individual worker by negotiating from them, and they should accept the wages they were offered. A union speaker responded with a separate vision that unions and workers, it's a very Marxian vision, were the source of wealth, and that they didn't see why men lived in brownstone fronts and never earned a dollar should live sumptuously while those who did the work lived poorly. There was also another attempt to enforce the temperance restrictions, the Sunday closing laws, and this backfired completely. By the election of the fall of 1873, an unheard of coalition of German and Irish in Chicago, amalgamated by this in their opposition to the Sunday closing, elected their candidate as mayor and their city common council. And this kind of back and forth would continue, I would say, for years, I'd say up to the present. And meanwhile, Chicago was rebuilding. But great trouble arrived, as it always does, when the economy went bad. At virtually the same time as the Interstate Exposition opened in the fall of 1873, a terrible depression, one of the worst in the country's history, the Panic of 1873, descended on the city and the country, largely caused by an overheated economy and unreasonable speculation in railroads, and a lot of values collapsed. By the winter, there was terrible unemployment. Weeks after this great celebratory fair, homelessness, hunger, people sleeping on the floor of police stations in the city. Knowing that the Chicago Relief and Aid Society still had some of that fire relief funds left, about $600,000 in 1871 dollars, probably 20 or 30 times that now, there were demands from workers that it help, to which it responded was, no, we'll give it to you in order, fill out the forms, apply by the rules, get your reference, and so on. And this all came to the head at Christmas of 1873, the terrible cold, terrible suffering. So by early 1874, the unemployed were demonstrating outside the relief and aid offices with signs that said things like bread or death. And people were getting more and more radicalized. None of this happens in some smooth, straight line way, but this is what's happening. And now looking ahead to the decades ahead, we see this continuing deep class and divisions along class and ethnic lines about the nature of the resurrected city, testing the idea of American exceptionalism. This is a place without class where anyone can get ahead, and involving a debate over the nature of the country and what should be done about it, all against a economy that's going up and down, a roller coaster economy. And we see coming out of the fire an increasing drawing of lines, of deepening even more of divisions that are, again, the fire makes visible and reinforces further, and they get reinforced all the more. Chicago is a central stage for all of these, such as the National Railroad Strike of 1877, where again there's pitched battles in the streets of Chicago with troops in the city. The Haymarket Rally, bombing, trial, executions, and pardon of the later 1880s and early 1890s. And the Pullman strike, which grew directly out of an even worse financial collapse than the one of 1873, the one of 1893, which followed very hard upon the World's Fair of 1893. That the first use of dynamite for terrorism. The central issue was the future of American democracy and what that involves. And it involves the same issues that we are still talking about today. People talking about the place and value of immigrants, of who is the true custodian of law and order. What does law and order even mean? Who are the people? What are our cities good places or bad places? Where's the future of America? And who and what stands for it? With people, working people saying it is capital that is out of control. It is owners who are causing all this chaos and this so-called anarchy. And of course, labor unions being accused of being radicals and communists and the like. And there are radicals and communists and the like running around. All of this is something I discuss at great length and detail in an earlier book, Urban Disorder and the Shape of Belief, which talks about the interrelation of action and idea in Chicago from the 1870s through the turn of the century, including such signal events that reflect attempts to try to deal with division and disorder, such as at the same time the construction of both Fort Sheridan and armories outside Fort Sheridan outside the city and armories inside it to guard against internal insurrection, but also Jane Addams founding Hull House to try to knit the social fabric back together. And Chicago is, again, as with Haymarket, as with the Pullman strike, the place where so many, representative events in this kind of division. And it's not just one set of issues, but others. The famous division over the gold standard in 1896. William Jennings Bryan gave his famous Cross of Gold speech, not only in Chicago, but a few blocks from the University of Chicago, a building that was then called the Coliseum at 63rd and Stony Island Avenue. 3 years earlier, by the way, right by there, Buffalo Bill had his Wild West show going at the same time as the fair. In 1905, on the north side, the IWW, the International Workers of the World, is founded in Chicago. The city is going in all kinds of different directions. You can't talk about, again, two directions, but it is deeply divided. The resurrected city is one that is booming and growing in all kinds of ways and exploding with people, but it's also exploding with social tension, quite literally in some cases. It is a city literally on fire in many ways throughout all of this. I like to talk in terms of giving a kind of emblematic anecdote, which I'll end with here, of two different stories that talk about what's going on in the two different ways they're going. The Panic of 1873, as I said, did not stop people from coming to Chicago. It stopped the rebuilding temporarily, but still all people kept coming to the city. That Chicago, whatever the problems were, there were more prospects there than elsewhere. And all kinds of people kept coming to Chicago. And one of the many people who came to Chicago, decided to come to Chicago, was a 17-year-old architect in training named Louis Sullivan, who worked for a leading architectural firm called Furness and Hewitt in Philadelphia. And they said, "We love you, Louis, but we have no work. We have to let you go." So he got on a train in the fall of 1873 and went to Chicago. And he famously, in his autobiography, he talks about seeing the prairie and the lake and seeing power everywhere and saying, "This is the place for me." Well, in that same year, there was a man named Albert Parsons who found himself in Philadelphia in the fall of 1873. And he had an absolutely wild life. While he came from what we would call fine New England stock, he had actually been born in Alabama and had volunteered for the Confederate Army when he was 13, but afterwards became pro-Reconstruction and pro-freedman, and started a Reconstruction paper in Texas, of all things, right after the war. And even more unexpectedly, married a woman named Lucy Elaine Gonzalez, who was born an African-American slave. But for all their idealism, they realized that their future was not in the South. So he was in Philadelphia, and he told Lucy to come meet him there, and they got on a train. I like this whole idea of perhaps Sullivan and the Parsons is on this train going to Chicago. And where do they go? Sullivan, of course, becomes involved in the architecture scene in the city and becomes a major figure in the building of this booming modern Chicago. It's a magnificent center of expansion and modernity. Parsons arrived. He was a printer at that point, joined a union, and he was radicalized by the demonstrations. He saw people asking for money from the Relief and Aid Society, and this radicalization continued on further and further. He became editor of the English language anarchist paper, The Alarm, and his career in Chicago ended on the gallows of the Cook County Jail at Illinois and Dearborn Street, the near north side, on August 11th, 1887, when he was hanged for his supposed role in the Haymarket bombing. So you see the city, the fire reveals these divisions and deepens them. And again, to kind of wrap things up, these are the way things continue to go in all kinds of ways. So the fire, we're still in many ways living in the heritage of it in all kinds of ways, where so many of the same issues still come up in all kinds of ways, reconfigured, come different ways out of different people's mouths. But that is the continuing story. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl, for that compelling talk. And we certainly can't consider Chicago Futures without tracing back to the history. So I wanted to turn it over to Dean Boyer with the first comment or question.
Thank you, Carl. That was absolutely fascinating. I would call it a kind of revisionist story because I think, as you suggested, the kind of usual narrative, the kind of textbook narrative of the 1871 fire is that it happens, and then all of a sudden, 20 years later, you have this kind of booming modern metropolis, and how it happened, who did it, who didn't help, who got hurt, who was left behind is kind of ignored. You know, as you know, I'm a historian of Europe and European studies. I've written a number of family-sized books on Vienna, and you know, in the rebuilding of the European cities, not just the German and Austrian cities, but the British cities, the bombed-out cities after World War II, which were oftentimes, you know, quite desolate. You know, if you say London rebuilt or Vienna rebuilt, you're really talking about city government, what we would call state government, and then federal government. It's really a kind of governmental initiative. It's not that there were citizens who were not involved, but this was basically a kind of top-down or a bottom-up, but kind of legitimate state-run operation. I guess your story is really almost like a stateless operation, a kind of weak city government. And somehow what we end up with in the 1890s is, you refer to this booming modern city. This is done by social forces without government regulation. This is really quite a fascinating image of, because Chicago is rebuilt with all of the kind of paralysis and tensions you're alluding to. But the question is of agency is like, who's doing this? Is it the bankers? Is it the people who founded the University of Chicago or Northwestern? Because they're not government officials, they're private citizens. Or is there some shadow government out there that is kind of assisting and guiding these people? If it's the former, it's really quite a fascinating difference between the European urban reconstruction.
There's no, I mean, when I was working on the plan of Chicago, the Burnham plan, you know, there's no emperor, there's no, you know, there's nothing like the rebuilding of Paris, which is top down.
Yeah, yeah.
So you have to get people to pass, you have to get a council to pass certain plans, and you have to get voters to vote, essentially to tax themselves.
Exactly.
But to answer your question earlier, yes, it is basically private investment. That urban government in the United States is minimal through much of the 19th century, and much just by people do not want taxes. One problem is that's why the fire department is so small at that time. And they don't want controls. They don't want fire limits. They want, you know, to do what they want with their private property. And so that does happen. And it is remarkable, among other things, how long it takes Chicago to have any kind of meaningful fire prevention. It's really early into the 20th century before that takes place. But there is the can I say, what we might call city planning or some sort of coordinated thing is not till really the 20th century. And it is entrepreneurs building, and the cities look that way as a result. A great suspicion of power, that what's happening in the late 19th century is cities are getting, the governments are getting more powerful and more centralized and raising taxes, and they're providing more and more services because people demand them, like water and schools and things like that. But for controlling where buildings are and what they go, that's a very suspicious thing. And even to this day, people bemoan the fate of, what can I say, culturally precious buildings in the face of the almighty dollar.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, John, for that question. Carl, I hope you have time. We have a few questions in the chat that I can relay over to you. The first one sounds like it might have come from a student, an anonymous student. Early on, you said there were many first-person narratives from the fire. Where can a student access these kinds of sources? Where do you do your research for books like these?
Well, a number of different places. And one problem is that, as one might expect, these are disproportionately things about people that you'd expect. That's to say, people who were literate, people who had a place they could sit and write, paper, leisure time, all that other stuff. So it's disproportionately from those people. But having said that, the Chicago History Museum has somewhere between 100 and 200 of these first-person narratives. A few of them have been published in my book. I list where you can find a number, and there's a very good collection of narratives collected early in the 20th century by a librarian of the History Museum named Mabel McIlvaine, and that's now available online. There are a lot of them also in the A.T. Andreas's 3-volume History of Chicago, particularly a 100-page section on the fire at the end of the second one. These are all cited in my book, and you can see that there, with including the URLs for them. One of the wonders of whatever else you want to say about digitization is a sweet spot is print, American print of the 19th and early 20th century. So there's a lot of the stuff written about the fire, a lot of newspapers from the time. If you're at the University of Chicago, you can read for free at the pay site of a number of newspapers, like the Chicago Tribune, and you can see interviews and speeches. I get a lot from there and those as well. But there's nothing like the real thing, especially once you can get back at it. The research center at the Chicago History Museum, where you can see the actual stuff, the originals, and a place like the Chicago Public Library and lots of other places. But I have a list of these things. We wish we had more from poor people. We wish we had more from immigrants. There are probably a lot of letters sent to Europe that I never read. One thing that is a source that I tried in this book to talk about these other people more than they'd previously talked about. The Newberry Library has a project called it's called the Foreign Language Project, where a number of foreign language papers are translated and they're now online. There's also the entire testimony of the fire inquiry. It took place in late November and early December, where the fire department held an inquiry, including Mrs. O'Leary's testimony, has been transcribed and is available online if you go to the Chicago History Museum site. I wouldn't be surprised if a number of major figures in the fire have a connection with the University of Chicago, and in its archives, there are the papers and letters from a number of people.
Great, and I was just going to encourage our students to use the university special collections.
One thing you might look at is there's a thing called the Chicago Collections. And what this is a website where a zillion institutions, including places like the University of Chicago, have listed what their holdings are related to Chicago history. And you can go to that and type in fire and see what it turns up. And it'll tell you where in the city of Chicago their holdings, whether and which ones are digitized and which ones aren't. This came very late in my career. I spent a lot of time looking for things that this would have saved me tremendous time. The University of Illinois at Chicago has a lot of stuff. Northwestern has stuff.
Great, thank you, Carl. Let me move on to a question about sort of what happens after your book ends. And so from another anonymous, with such anti-immigrant rhetoric, what helped give rise to the now famous history of the Irish Catholic politicians in Chicago?
Well, the anti-Irish rhetoric was part in reaction to that. The Irish arrived earlier than the Germans. Irish people arrived in large numbers in the 1840s. Chicago, people started arriving in Chicago in numbers starting in the 1830s. Irish in the 1840s, they settled around Bridgeport, where they helped build the Illinois and Michigan Canal between the 1830s and the late 1840s. Germans start coming around the 1840s, and they surpass the Irish in numbers, but the Irish sort of get the hang of local politics early and have a disproportionate thing. And so the German newspaper at the time of the fire is complaining that there are more Germans in Chicago, but there are more Irish aldermen than there are German aldermen. So they get kind of rooted in early as they see that's the way to power, that's the way to jobs, that's the way to control. It gets complicated things in unions. It gets complicated in the fire and the police department as well, with all kinds of ethnic tensions there. So they get rooted early and don't let go. They don't hold without break. There's plenty of more Yankee mayors. There's as well. There's the first actually born abroad Chicago mayor is Anton Cermak, who's Czech in the 1930s. But the Irish are by mid 19th century are rooted in Chicago politics, and this is both in reaction to and adds fuel to anti-Irish.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question. I apologize if I didn't get to all of them. This goes back to your sources, and it has some interesting questions for historians of the future looking back on us today. You make a mention of a number of events whose histories are controverted even in the time. How, as a historian, do you make sense of the facts behind the events when confronted with conflicting stories from completely different news ecologies and in this history languages as well?
Well, one of the things, first of all, that's a terrific question, and which I'm going to basically blather around and duck. One of the things that I'm most interested in is studying words and rhetoric as a form of action, and talk about how they're inseparable. I talk about in another book, the infrastructure of ideas is inseparable from bricks and mortar, that cities are expressions of ideas. I think what you have to remember in all this is that it's very rarely either or, it's both and, that conflicting things can coexist at the same time, sometimes, of course, in the head of a single person. And so I don't know if I'm ducking your question. I didn't mean to make a joke of that, but you can't say there is the this or the cause or this reason or that. It's almost always, especially when you're dealing with something as complicated as cities, a combination of things in which things can go in a number of different directions, and for whatever set of reasons in the moment go a certain way. I mean, you see this as you look around the last couple of weeks. or you see whatever, but Trump or Biden supporters who hold what seem to be conflicting ideas at the same time. It's a mess, but what can I say? Is when it gets to be a real mess is when you have alternate facts and things like that. But what is almost always going on in any kind of discussion are conflicting world views, understandings of the nature of experience, and what controls what people think. So basically, you look at the last elections, two different visions of what the United States is and should be.
Great. Well, we're unfortunately out of time, but I wanted to thank you, Carl, on behalf of the University, the College, and Chicago Studies for kicking us off with this fascinating discussion on the evolution of the built and social environments in Chicago. I think we have a great starting place to go into the Chicago Future series, and we hope that you'll join us for the subsequent events. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and feel free to get in touch if someone has any questions.
Great, thank you. So on behalf of the college at the University of Chicago, Chicago Studies, and the Parzia Program for Public Discourse, we'd like to thank Dean Boyer and Professor Smith for their remarks tonight, and to everybody for participating in this evening's presentation. The recording of this evening's session will be available on the Chicago Studies website later this week, as well as information to purchase Professor Smith's book about the Great Chicago Fire. It's right back here if you can see it. And
Perfect
also
Valentine's Day gift.
a perfect Valentine's Day gift, that's right. And a Vermont walking tour of the sites in the book will also be live on the Chicago Studies website. I encourage everyone to check that out. As a reminder, this lecture was only the first in a series of upcoming events. Our next event will be a conversation on the future of Chicago restaurants. I believe that is next Friday. Yes, that will take place next Friday at 12:30 over Zoom. Our next distinguished lecture will be 2 weeks from tonight. So they're every other Wednesday. It'll be presented by Leila Brammer, director of the Parzia program, and is entitled The Discursive City. We look forward to you joining us then. Thank you, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you.